One of the thank you. First of all, thank you for another amazing class and lecture, Dr. J, on our history, on our Wakandawan history. One of the things that you mentioned I thought was fascinating, that we just don't know about American history. And you talked about this in 1607, I believe it was.
Jamestown.
Jamestown.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that for us?
It's even deeper than that. The English, Johnny-come-latelys to the colonization of the New World. The powers who had the capability of working the New World were on the Iberian Peninsula, that's Spain and Portugal. So because they had been looking for a route to the eastern part of Africa, and on that they had also a route to go to Asia, the Portuguese was traveling down the coast of Africa trying to get to the east. And so in 1482, they came back and put in a base at Elmina. 1492, Portugal sailing around Africa to go to the east. Columbus, with his understanding of the maps and whatnot that were produced at the time, thought that he could go west and discover India. And so in 1492, Columbus went west. And so Spain and Portugal on the world stage were discovering all these places. Not discovering, they bumped into all these world places. So they had to go to the Pope in Rome. In 1493, they had to go to the Pope in Rome to decide who gets what of these so-called discoveries. And so unbelievably, the Pope, in one of the crucial moments of corruption in the church in Rome, the Pope decreed the papal bull, and established later by the nations of Spain and Portugal in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1493. From the North Pole, a line was drawn to the South Pole. And on the west side of that line, all the territories belonged to Spain. And on the east side of that line, all of them belonged to Portugal. Now, this is unbelievable. This meant that Spain had all of North America, Central America, South America, and some of the islands of the Pacific. And Portugal got the Atlantic Ocean, Africa, and some of the land in the Pacific. Now, these two insignificant nations, Spain and Portugal, began to operate as if this was real. And so they went sailing across the ocean, planting flags and whatnot, claiming other people's land. And so they were the premier Catholic nations. So they had made sure the arrangements to pay the Pope and whatnot had been made. And so now that's 1492, Columbus in Africa, 1490 in the New World, 1482 in Africa, 1492 in the New World. That's why I said we got to get the
chronology.
Chronology. Now, for 100 years, these Catholic nations are getting wealthy with this wealth from the New World, Native American land, and Africa. But the English are just pirates. Their royal throne doesn't have the strength of a Spain or France even, and Portugal. And so 1560s, Queen Elizabeth I is sending her sea dogs out to rip off the Spanish Main. In other words, enormous wealth coming from the New World. Whole mountains of silver were discovered in Peru. And so the Spanish Main was going back with the gold and the silver. And so the English pirates were blessed by the Queen to rip them off. And in fact, she knighted two of these pirates. Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Francis Drake, and Mark Hopkins. These were the brothers who, there were three of them, but two of them were knighted. And so they brought the wealth into England. So in the late 1500s, England said, we need to get our base in the New World. So they sent fleets to the area called the Carolinas. And unfortunately, the Spanish were fighting them because the Spanish were in Florida and Georgia. Unfortunately, they did not find what they wanted. So they had to settle for a colony without this great wealth. And because they didn't know how to handle these forest areas and this ecology, these poor Englishmen did what Englishmen have done, and Germans and others in the caves. The initial English colony was not able to sustain itself, and they went into cannibalism. They had attempted to go back, and in order to go back, because they couldn't make it, they had to take lots on who was going to be eaten next. They miscalculated on what they would need to even go back. So it's an enormous tragedy, but it's something that we need to look up. All of us need to know that the first time they came to try to establish something among the English areas, because what these people did, they said, well, this is your land. William Penn, you take Pennsylvania, Virginia. I mean, in other words, Native American lands were just given over to these Europeans who had no right to them. And so England, unfortunately, had been through a separation from Catholicism. So when I have my 50-year turning point of history, which we'll deal with the next time, 3 50-year turning points of history. One is the turning point of history that lets us go into depth with what African civilization was all about, and that's the turning point of history, BC. In other words, 1490 to 1540 is the turning point of history, in which I call it the Queen T era, the Amenhotep III era. That's the new kingdom. And the Wakanda moment was when so much pollution had come in from the outside, we needed to redo our sacred space and our special community. And so the African Queen T and her son and Nefertiti, who was supposed to marry Queen T's husband as a diplomatic marriage, since he died, she married him to Akhenaten, the pharaoh Akhenaten. And then a later member of the family was King Tut. So that whole process of King Tut that we have to begin to appreciate has to be seen by our. Yeah, so
it's right there, but the box is over there. So I don't know what that sound is.
At any rate, King Tut represents that materialism that that King talked about, the materialism that Akhenaten's father and mother talked about, and the greed and the lack of spirituality that was dominating the African traditions. So here is an example of what we're talking about. King Tut is revered as the most significant thing discovered in the Nile Valley, when in point of fact, this is the cover of a great book on the Egyptian Museum, and the people who need to be revered, who saw the need to establish a new Wakanda moment and build a new city of God. This is Queen T sitting with equal majesty with her husband. It's a 2-story statue. Her husband represented one of the greatest men in human history. and she continued that tradition by herself. So when they had the Queen Mothers and others in the Black Panther movie, this is a tradition built into our people from the very beginning. The beginning symbolically of the African traditions have to do with the role of the women who produce life, sustain life, and can renew life. And so we have to understand that our tradition doesn't have the male dominating, it has the complementarity of the male and the female. And so here you see it. So for these brothers and sisters to decide to go into the desert to build a new city, that's an enormous moment. That's a Wakanda. And the strength that they had was their spirituality, and not just their military dominance or their spiritual dominance. And they built temples, pillar temples that the Greeks worship, pillar temples that we've got in Washington, D.C. That comes out of the deep African tradition. And in the African tradition, each of the pillars meant a moral and ethical value. It was not just a beautiful structure like the Greeks built, but it was a spiritual structure and a structure that taught lessons to be learned about this universe, this universal process that we're a part of. So that we have to give thanks, as I have done often, that Africans are making their way. This gives us the chronology and the facts that we need. I'm blessed to have helped to get it translated into English. The old root of the human family going back millions of years, first 100 and so pages. And then in the middle 100 and so pages, modern humanity, 200,000 years old. And he talks about the northern cradle, the cradle of the ice and the cradle of the sun. And then in the last 100 pages, he talks about the last 10,000 years, the African cradle of civilization in the river valleys, particularly the Nile River Valley. And the beauty of it, he includes a small chapter on culture. So that process that I'm talking about, economics, politics, and culture, that I got out of my studying in Europe when they were talking about rebuilding a new world, 1959, the European world had been bombed and destroyed. 100 million people killed or maimed, cities, whole cities destroyed. So the Europeans came up with a formula of rebuilding called the Marshall Plan, but it was the European Common Market. So they started with the oil, the rural community between France and Germany is this valley with a lot of coal. And so they started with the steel and coal complex in the Ruhr Valley. I'm in Europe in 1959, and they're talking about, and this process started in 48, 59. So it is ongoing. And the people who helped to put it together, Professor Olays and Professor Berlin, these are my professors, and they talked about how they helped put these things together, and they started with economics. And the economics can't work if you don't have a sound politics to manage the economics, and then culture is the key. They were creating out of dozens of European nations, one nation. And so they had to have the culture, and that culture was the culture of white domination and white supremacy. And then the coal and steel community, I'm sitting in a classroom in the amphitheater with a couple hundred students, the only black person there, and Professor Olays, I forgot which professor it was, he was talking about no nation should be so wealthy it could afford a 100-day steel strike. The US had a 100-day steel strike, and they're using the steel coal complex to rebuild their world. And here we are so wealthy because in World War II, the wealth of the world came to us. We were not destroyed. We had the concentration of maybe half of the world's wealth was concentrated in America. So we could afford a stupid 100-day steel strike. But the students in the class were looking, they turned around to look up at me because he was referencing America negatively. But I'll tell you one thing, I never forgot it. I never forgot that this whole process of economics is so important. And that
what was that quote you had earlier? You were speaking in a different language. It wasn't Senegalese. It was a different.
It was French in Guinea.
What was the quote? Because that was a very powerful quote. What was that, Dr. J?
The Guineans had a national anthem, And the national anthem for the young, the old, those that were serious and those that were not, was Nous préférons, we prefer la misère dans l'esclavage, the misery in slavery, than opulence in the misery in freedom than opulence in l'esclavage. Nous préférons la misère dans la liberté à l'opulence dans l'esclavage. We prefer the misery in freedom than living high in slavery.
Wow.
So that was a statement that all the African nations have applied, that this, we're having a plantation economy now. These nations have not become full African nations. They haven't unified. There's a whole phase that we're
That
going.
was Wakanda. That was Killmonger's quote, wasn't it?
That's
I was
right.
like, oh my God, when you said that, I said, that's Killmonger. That's where they got that from. Oh, that was beautiful, brother.
That's
Thank
why
you
I'm
for
saying,
sharing.
Brother Smalls, he said, look, don't be, this is a movie, but no, for me, it gives me a chance to see this sea change pass, and I know it's going to pass. Even after I leave here, it's going to pass on to other people. Our people are going to be able to use this real history,
Yes.
but they got to show that the mountains of Brazil was Wakanda, the highlands of Haiti was Wakanda, the black swamp in Alabama and Georgia, Virginia, the Dismal Swamp was Wakanda. And then African leaders and Nkrumah dreamed of a new city, a city that was going to be a Marxist-Leninist achievement. And then his neighbor next door, Ufred Bunny, and I studied that, I lived it. I was there for several years. And I went there 61 and saw this new city of skyscrapers and bridges and airport. I said it was better than cities in America. And however, the leader was a traditional chief trained by the French, but his traditionalism says that there's too much materialism. The plateau area, which is like Manhattan, that was restricted to the French and the elite. And then they built these beautiful suburbs, and that was French and the elite. And around them were all of these not too bad areas, but because they had enough money to build decent housing for the Africans. But they had an apartheid government in 1961 when I saw this beautiful city and couldn't even pronounce the name when I first got there. Spent the summer there, and then we traveled up country, and we went to his village. And he had envisioned, just like Nkrumah had envisioned, a new city that was going to be industrial and was going to be sharing the wealth and was going to be a paradise. Ufred Bunny, this neo-colonialist, they call him, and the worst person, no vision for his people. No, he had a vision. And that vision came from Kemetic. The vision came out of the Rosicrucian movement. The Rosicrucian movement, which I had a chance to be to connect with, because I went to San Jose in 1969 to set up the Black Studies Department, and there was the Rosicrucian Center. So these Africans who I had met before in Africa, because I had a 10-year experience before I went to San Jose in Africa, Africans who I had known for 10 years, when they greeted me anew, and I said, New York is fine, but I'm not in New York, I'm in San Jose, they got up and gave me another hug, another handshake. These were Africans who were part of the Rosicrucian movement in Dahomey, in Ivory Coast, in Senegal. And so we have to understand these schools of knowledge, these mystery schools, have been a process that has gone on secretly among our people to sustain them. So here is the Marxist, third worldist, and Nkrumah dreaming of a new city of manufacturing wealth and the sharing and equal housing that's equal for people, and housing estates and schools and a new port, etc. And then next door, just a few miles away, is Ivory Coast. And this president had forced the France to build a new city, to build a modern city, because they said, we can't have our wealth going to Senegal to build an administrative colonial center for all of West Africa, and Guinea's wealth to go. So some of that wealth has to stay locally and take care of our people. Now, can you imagine? That was part of the dialogue in the Black Panther movie, the question of whether the wealth should stay, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
I lived that with these great leaders. I lived it with Nkrumah. I lived it with Sekou Touré. I lived it with Houphouët-Boigny. I have to be able to tell a story, even if I get it taped and may never get it printed. I lived in those mountains in Guinea, and I know where Sekou Touré had created what he called Cité Nouvelle, the new city. And we saw these young people being evaluated by a UNESCO team because the new math that they were being taught was the math that was used to fly satellites. An 11-year-old had mastered that math, and he was teaching it to an 8-year-old. And the UNESCO committee was there to evaluate it. That's Sekou Touré. He never got a chance to implement this, but that's where his mind was. That's where he wanted to go. Our brother Kwame Nkrumah wanted to create a new world of Africa using this understanding that we share and we care and whatnot. So he built a new city, but he had to have it built by what was his name called? Claw. He had to have it built. The one who was the CIA agent.
Yes.
He wanted to do it like Nasser had done it. Nasser in Egypt inspired Nkrumah to build a new industrial city. And Nasser, in order to do it, he had to go against the deep Nile Valley traditions. Nasser had to dam the Nile. So the regular flow of the Nile would not take place, but he says we got to have industrialization. We're in the modern world. So Nasser in 52 was dreaming of a Wakanda. And how do we do it? And he had the problem of flooding, creating a high dam. But in order to do that, that meant that the remains, the temples of Nubia, Upper Nubia, of that part of Nubia would be flooded. And so in the 60s, knowing that the flood was coming, they sent out an international call, and over 100 universities came to start digging in the Nile before the water behind the new dam became so high. And so to save Wakanda with this new vision, they had a dilemma. Eventually, Nasser went to the Russians to build it. The Russians were involved in a war with America, so now with the Western world. So the Russians built the great dam for him. Unfortunately, he had gotten a conflict with his own people. He was overthrown. And then eventually his own people who overthrew him were overthrown. And now you have the chaos that you now have. So that movie script, they did not know they were duplicating reality in the African experience.
Wow.
But the inspiration of this dam and a new world was Nkrumah. He took it. And the question was, who are we going to get to build it? And he said, you Western world, you control most of our building. And if you don't help us with it, we're going to go to the Russians. And just as Gamal Nasser had done. And so the Western world said, no, we'll do it. So a conglomerate of nations, Germany, England, Canada, the US, and France, they said that they would build it. And they built it. I was there from 61, 62, 63, 64, 65. I was in and out of Africa. I saw it finally completed. And I was making a 13-nation trip throughout Africa for the Operation Crossroads program with Rosalind. And we went into the Congo, Congo-Brazzaville, into the Congo, Congo-Leopoldville, and other African nations. And so when we got back after this 13-nation tour, we were in Ghana and we were tired. So we had said, let's go back to next store to Ghana. It's only a 40-minute ride. And then we can come at any other time. But the day that we flew out, the night that we flew out, rumor was that Nkrumah had left for China with 60 to 80 of the leaders of Ghana. He went to celebrate. The Western world gave him the keys to the dam and the smelter and the projects. And as he went out of Africa, taking his leadership because he didn't trust anybody, and he flew to Peking, to celebrate with Mao Zedong. Ostensibly, he was going to try to help out with the Vietnam War. Ho Chi Minh and General Giap, they didn't allow Mao Zedong to interfere with their war. They were going to take care of the Japanese, as they're going to take care of the French just as they took care of the Japanese. And they built a Wakanda experience. Now, I'm stretching it. But his spirit is saying, go ahead and do it, brother. Only you can do it. Only you experienced it. The Americas had dropped the atomic bomb. They ended World War II by tricking the Japanese. They dropped one atomic bomb and said, this is what you don't get if you don't submit. And the Japanese were saying, where the hell did this come from? They just wiped out our whole city. And then before the Japanese could get their thoughts back together again, here comes the boom. Here comes the next one. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki were wiped out. But they did not know. They were tricked. They didn't know that America had shot its load. Any male or female enjoying the pleasure of male and female, once you get to that point where you shoot your load, you are finished for the moment. So America told the Japanese, we got more in coming. So the Japanese, who have a tradition of not even surrender, they commit harikari, they commit suicide rather than surrender.
Right.
They had to surrender. And then we got the Japanese eventually on our side of this struggle that emerged around Russia. But Ho Chi Minh, knowing that they didn't have the building that the Japanese had or the building of the Chinese, they built a sacred ground, a special place of struggle under the rainforest in Vietnam. They built tunnels and whatnot. They built them structured so that large bone Americans and French and Europeans couldn't get through there. But the smaller people, they actually created a sacred place and a special place in the jungle. So that for Nkrumah, he wanted to celebrate his third worldness. But he if I had been advising him, I would have said, go up to Kumasi. You should have gone up there before. You went across the African continent to get an Arab wife in order to link up with Gamal Nasser so that there'd be a continental Pan-African a movement. But you should have gone up to Kumasi, to the Ashanti, and asked them for a royal wife. And then you would have had your base solidified, you know. And even in the African tradition, you could get one or two more wives, a diplomatic wife. So he could have gone to Egypt, got a diplomatic wife. But at any rate, we're redoing the history that happened. But the reality is that the inspiration that Nkrumah got from Nasser, and even though Nasser completed the dam, he eventually was overthrown by other forces. And Nkrumah was overthrown by his own people. And then he didn't have the forces in place or the leadership in place for the counter attack. And so here he was, the greatest of Africans, caught out of Africa and in Peking. And he became an embarrassment for Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh and his Chou Enlai, his prime minister. And so he eventually left. And we were all in tears that our greatest leader was without his country. And so we didn't know what to do. There was nothing we could do. And Nkrumah didn't know what to do, but he knew he had allies in Eastern Europe because that's where Yugoslavia and others, Tito was forming the Third World Movement, the non-aligned movement. And Nkrumah and Nasser and the others wanted to be a part of that. They didn't want to be linked to communist Russia. They didn't want to be linked to capitalist America. So they were in the Third World Movement. And so Nkrumah decided to go to Romania where he had some friends and to finish out his life there or to engineer a military coup from afar from there. But as I said, he did not create around him that spiritual, committed brotherhood. Africans' leadership is trained, that you train people in your traditions, and you do it for years, if not decades, maybe 10 or 20 or 30 years. You went to the Great Lodge, the Waset Temple. You didn't get a degree in a BA or something in a couple of years. You didn't get a master's in, no, you spent a whole process, a lifetime of getting you prepared to take leadership. And it was a leadership process. So Nkrumah had not picked up that part of what was going on. Ulford Bunny, later I'll show that he did tap into the training of his people in the Nile Valley tradition, but the French tradition was so strong, it did not take hold. But Nkrumah, however, had done what Africans do, help their brothers. And Nkrumah helped his brother Sekou Touré, who was up in Guinea talking mess. Nous préférons la misère. We prefer misery and freedom than opulence and slavery.
Wakanda forever.
Wakanda forever. And he was in Ghana. Ghana is wealthy, gold and wood and precious metals. Guinea is super wealthy. Guinea has iron and bauxite, whole mountain ranges. Guinea has the forest area. Guinea has the north with the cattle, etc. And Guinea has the Fujigalan, where the temperature is temperate. And so, and then they have the coast and the greatness in the forest. So, and the rivers to be able to dam up. However, Sekou Touré didn't have the economics. He had the political structure. He had the cultural structure. The economics was so rudimentary that he became so political and beating back groups, fighting them, the different ethnic groups. He couldn't get a coalition of unity. So he never developed the system to take the great wealth of Guinea and be a beacon for African liberation. However, Ghana had a head start because of the Pan-Africanism that came from Black America and the Caribbean. In 1945, they were there, these Pan-African leaders from the Black world, and Nkrumah was there, Du Bois was there, the family of Marcus Garvey was there, the Great Pan-African Conference, October, November 1945, and they had dreams of a free Africa, an Africa that can control its own destiny. In other words, they were thinking of a place of peace and a place of prosperity, and not of slavery and colonialism. And so all of them divided up and went home to plant the seeds. Jomo Kenyatta went to Kenya. Nnamdi Azikiwe went back to Nigeria. W.E.B. Du Bois came back to America. Padmore eventually went to Ghana. He's from Trinidad and Tobago, but he went to Ghana to join Nkrumah. C.L.R. James stayed in England to be a radical. And Ross McConnell left Guyana to be a part of this vision, this dream, and to put it in place. And his great book is Pan-Africanism Within. Padmore's great book is Communism or Capitalism. And so I have to, and with a group of our people have to put in place, how do we understand this? Since I personally experienced it and personally met most of these brothers and certainly have all of their work, that we need to put, Padmore was the leading communist in the world in the 30s. He was on the Comintern. And so this leading position he had let him see what communism in real terms was. It was not a theoretical formula of the workers of the world unite and then the proletariat dictatorship of the proletariat and the sharing of the wealth. It came out of Russia, and Russia was the foundation of it. And so white Russian nationalism became its reality once Stalin got in the picture. And so this whole dream of an egalitarian society, sharing and whatnot, was not real. And Padmore was there to see it. So he wrote his book to warn our people. It's Pan-Africanism or communism, and for him, it is Pan-Africanism. Ross McConnell was an entrepreneur, and he went to England with them. And he helped to finance the Pan-African Conference. and all the activities that he had restaurants. And so these brothers, no matter what they were doing as radicals in England, knew they was going to get something to eat. And so he had to put together in every term. But he was not going to go back to Guyana. He eventually went to Kenya to join his old buddy, the senior Jomo Kenyatta. So he began to move around because the colonies were still dominated by the British influence or the French influence. So the relationship with these brothers and what they did, this is a fantastic story. And for them to have gone home to take a rudimentary movement in the bush and turn it into a revolutionary movement, or take a sacred oath of the Mau Mau people who wanted their Wakanda back. The white folks took the white highlands and said it's ours. And the Kikuyu said, no, that's ours. And Jomo Kenyatta was one of those who had to help to lead the fight. So the story of the transition, the movement, the ideas, I mean, that's so fantastic. Mm-hmm. And Nkrumah took 10 million pounds, that might be like $50 million now. In 1958, when Guinea said they wanted their independence, the French General de Gaulle said, if you want your independence, you can have it. We're going to give it to you. And we're going to pull everything out of Guinea, including the toilet paper and the telephones and the school records. And they did. They tried to bring Sekou Touré to his knees. Mm. Ghana, who got their independence in 57 and became relatively wealthy because of cocoa. And cocoa, chocolate, was needed as part of the great struggle in Asia, in Vietnam, with the French fighting the insurgents. And eventually the Americans took it up. So when you have to have your troops out and they need even chocolate bars in the knapsack of a soldier is energy and whatnot. So the price of cocoa leaped high. So Ghana had a great surplus because it was one of the leading cocoa nations in the world. So Nkrumah had the consciousness to take that wealth and offer it to Guinea to save their revolution. Wow. And so this brotherhood relationship, again, you have in Wakanda all of these brother things and who's related to who. And so Sekou Touré was related to Nkrumah through ideology, that economics of Ghana, the capitalist economics, allowed Nkrumah to take that money and save the Guinea revolution. And interestingly enough, Sekou Touré repaid it, because when Nkrumah lost his nation and he was in Eastern Europe, our brother Sekou Touré said, come home to Africa, brother. You can be the president of Guinea. And he eventually worked it out. Nkrumah didn't speak French, so he really couldn't be the president, but this was how they were going to work it out. And he created a dual presidency. So Nkrumah was able to spend the last 7 or 8 years of his life in freedom, writing the books and whatnot on struggle and whatnot. So that's something that if these brothers and sisters put their monies together and their skills together, and in 5 years or so come up with a true history of Africa and struggle in Africa, they could actually use the relationship between Nkrumah and Sekou Touré as brothers, helping each other, and then the disconnect because of the European world or whatever, and the Kemetic tradition, Isfet, evil and whatnot emerged between them and causes a disconnect between the two brothers, who eventually led to Assar and all of that difficulty with Set. But they can actually point to where one brother actually saved the revolution of another, and then years later, that savior was repaid, and they could make it into a fantastic thing. But and it will be part of the history, the real history. Mm-hmm. And then Guinea is next door to Ivory Coast, and they're French speaking. And so Houphouët-Boigny and others took the French independent self-government, and they worked it to the max. Houphouët-Boigny squeezed them to put money. We can't have our cocoa, coffee money, our wood going out to build up that car or to France. Some of that money has to stay in Ivory Coast. So in 51, they made a deal. You got to cut a sandbar. You have to cut a canal through the sandbar to allow us to create the lagoon as a deep water port for Abidjan. So from 51, this little colonial capital emerged as a metropolis. And it can be shown. You can fly planes over it, and it will be just like in the Black Panther movie, flying over these fantastic cities and this and that and whatnot. A new port, a new airport, a new fish port, a new log port, all of that stuff. And but what happened was the leader, the visionary, the old man who was considered a neo-colonialist, considered a flunky, he had his vibranium. And his vibranium was the ideas and the culture of the Nile Valley. And he came at it through the Rosicrucian movement. So he and Nkrumah had a wager. We'll see where we are in 10 years. Let's say a wager they made around 1960 or so. That's when Ivory Coast got its independence. Ghana had its independence for 5 years, since 57. And so the wager was, you go your way with socialism, African socialism, Marxist-Leninism, that's now called African socialism, and I'll go my way with economics, politics, and culture that I'm going to call Société d'État, controlled capitalism. In other words, capitalism of the state. And so here you had these two systems right next to each other being developed by these brothers. Both of them had their Wakanda ideas. I don't care what anybody else said. I've experienced it. And Charles can't laugh. I'm mad at him to this day. To a dozen slave forts and dungeons all along that African coast. Nobody has done that. From the Ivory Coast, half a Sini, to Keita, near to Togo border. And then we had a chance to go to Ivory Coast and see the dream of this brother, his new city of God. We were there.
Wow.
We were there, planned. It was being planned for 10 years. And Charles didn't take a single photo that he now has to put up on the table.
Why is that, Charles?
Why is it, Charles?
Because I do have pictures when I gave him a copy too, where he lost. It's not lost; it's misplaced within the Jeffries treasury, like the lost ark. But we did not have phones with cameras in them back in those days. We had the little disposable cameras, and I was a broke student, so I could carry until they ran out.
And we had this other thing. What did they call it? Where you could Polaroids. And
yeah.
I didn't even have that.
Africans went crazy when we first went to Africa with these Polaroids. That opened us up to Africa. They couldn't believe it. They thought we had some juju in him. You said, yes, we got this blackness. That's our juju. But the two brothers next to each other built new cities. The two brothers above them built new cities. Now, one is Sekou Touré. He had this consciousness that we're going to take the traditional strength and whatnot that we have, and we're going to complement it with modernity. We're going to take the traditional way we raise cattle, and we're going to use modern cattle raising methods. So that was Guinea. I was there in 63. 62, I was in Senegal. 61, I was in the Ivory Coast and Ghana. So I'm telling you that I have in my documentation a PhD that has the Ivory Coast story, not fully visible because I didn't get approval from the secret societies to put this knowledge in place. And your buddy, Professor James Small, and he, over the years, was telling me, you're going to die. You need to put the story out there.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so the story is covered up. Instead of the New City of God, I call it the National Council. They called it the National Council, Conseil National. And this Conseil National could be 50 leaders, 100 leaders, 500 leaders, or 1,000 leaders, depending upon the circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
And they met in their various places. Since I was living there and everybody knew me, I could go into the meetings. They thought I was a part of the meetings.
Mm.
In fact, one group of Africans came to visit the Ivory Coast. That was a part of the Crossroads program that I was with. But of course, I'm in Ivory Coast now working on my PhD. So here comes 35 leaders from Crossroads. And so the head of protocol of Ivory Coast, George Wignon, we're standing there with the president, and here comes this group, and George Wignon, who usually does the courtesies, he says, Dr. Jeffries, why don't you do the courtesies and introduce them to the president? And so I did that, and then the group left, and I was with the president and George, and then I said my goodbyes to them and went to join the group. And later, George Wignon told me that he was the head of protocol for Ufebwene for 30 years. So you know he was more than the head of protocol. He was a part of the Society of Secrets. And so George had said to the president had said to George, who's the new boy on the block? In other words, he thought I was part of the staff. But I became close to one of his partners, who was the chief of a village called Niable, and I have it in the dissertation. And I said to myself, why is this village noted on the map as a model village? So I went up there to the village. And because I had been living in Africa 61, and here is now 65, I had many, many Africa trips. So I went to the village, and he showed me around, and it got dark. And he said, well, you can't, no. First, he was taking me around. He was fascinated by this Black American who was interested and knew his country. Mm. So he had to eat at midday. And so he had a special library that even his wife couldn't go into. And just outside the library, he had a sitting room, and that's where we ate. Then when we visited more of his plantations and things like that and the stuff that he was doing, his people were doing, it got dark. And then I said, well, I'm going to have to go back to one of the regional capitals, Bangalore. And he said, no, you can't go at night. You got to stay here. In other words, he had already gotten fascinated with me. And so now, especially when we ate, because when he put the food in front of me, I didn't look for a knife and fork. And I knew that I couldn't use this left hand. But I got this hand going into that fufu and that inyam, and I was eating. Breaking bread with him was an enormous thing. In other words, he just attached himself spiritually to this Black American, digging in his bowls and eating food like he does. And so then he said, you'll have to stay. And my nephew in the next compound is a pharmacy, and he has quarters over there for you. And so that old man broke it down on how a society of secrets inspired by the Rosicrucian movement, and the Rosicrucian movement was inspired by the Pharaoh Akhenaten. Pharaoh Akhenaten was birthed by Queen Mother T. And from that point on, I had access to this society of secrets. And what they did was they not only had this experimental agriculture, which he had in this model village, but Ufot-Bunis took his village, his African village, and used it as a model for industrialization. You go into the village, and when I first went there in '61, there were streets laid out, but no buildings. And I come back there again, '62, now the streets are being filled up, etc. And eventually he built a model city that had a peace palace. And Ufot-Buni knew that Akhenaten was the pharaoh of peace. And so that peace palace was the administrative headquarters. And later they built another administrative building and they made it the Peace Foundation. Akhenaten was the pharaoh of peace. Eventually they built a cathedral, a pillared temple. And in order to make it a basilica, they had to go to the Roman Catholic Church to get the official stamp of a basilica. And several times I've been there, one time with some of our leading educators, including Wade Noble, another time with Jesse Jackson and 400 leaders of Black America that came over with Reverend Sullivan, who had this African-American summits. And so the fantastic thing was that I try to tell the head of education, the Minister of Education, that when the Black Americans come, show them the whole thing, this new city of God. And of course, they didn't pay me no mind. He agreed that he would, but he didn't pay me no mind. So when we got off of this 747, because I said, how are they going to move us from Abidjan up to Yamoussoukro? Well, they had put in a new airport and all of us got on one plane, or we got on two planes, and we flew up to go to this Wakanda. And the first thing we did was to go to the basilica. And the Catholic Church had used leverage by saying that we'll allow it to be a basilica if you build a university medical school. The Catholics know how to do this thing. With a university medical school, they would be able to attract some of the best students in wherever there is a Catholic colony. They make sure that there's a medical facility because they need the medical. They're in the tropics, so they need it. But they can train leaders that they can pull into the Catholic consciousness and have the skills to serve. And so, but Ufot-Buni, he went for this because he was trained as a medical doctor in the French tradition. And they had a full doctor, which was the European, and they had an African doctor who had knowledge of African medicine and herbs plus European medicine. So he was trained in Senegal at the Gorée Island, where they had a special school called the École de William-Ponty, the School of William-Ponty, which was the name of a French governor who was preparing African doctors. So Ufot-Buni, because he had this medical thing, he wanted a big hospital that the Catholic Church would help put together to go with the basilica. But that's not where his heart was. And even in the basilica, you have these stained glass. And in the stained glass, and the tradition of the Catholic Church, at the bottom, you have a picture of the creator or the architect. And there's a little picture of Ufot-Buni watching Jesus carrying a cross during the Easter time. See, this, I've never mentioned this. This is the first time that the Creator said, it's time for you to let some of that shit out, and so you can start anew with something. The great mural in the basilica is a picture of Jesus and the resurrection period. Resurrection is rebirth. Resurrection is Agnaton. So for Ufred Bunny, it had a special Catholic meaning, but for Ufred Bunny, because he was Rosicrucian, it had a deeper meaning. So when I'm in this space, as I often did, I told the Catholic priest, I said, head priest, every major Catholic institution has a shrine of the Black Madonna. Where is the shrine in this basilica? I'm with my group now. People were there to witness. He said, this is the shrine of the Black Madonna.
Mm.
You know what I said? He said, this is the shrine of the Black Madonna. And I have to understand him, and I appreciate him, because downstairs, I started to bring it up here. You have the Pope, John Paul II, dying, and he is being funeralized in the Basilica of St. Peter's, which is a pillared temple. And in the heart of that basilica is a tekken that was dragged out of the Nile and put in the heart of Roman Catholicism, and a cross on the top.
Mm.
Charles, downstairs, look beyond the desk there, and you'll see a newspaper with the Pope lying down. Yeah. In other words, all of this is so real that we who want to get into a special learning process, we've got to do more than what we think we need to do. You see, we have to, just as Wade Nobles was able to take the leaders of the Haitian Revolution and give them all a period of where they brought ideas in and then produced this powerful force that was able to can you imagine a Wakanda sequence in the mountains of Haiti? And these warriors and these women, warriorettes,
Mm-hmm.
beat up the French colon and their military, eventually destroyed Brûlez car coupe-tête. That was the cry of Dessalines, because he had seen how they had messed up Toussaint, who trusted the French because he had become one of their great military leaders, and he had helped the French protect the greatest wealth-producing part of their world. And so eventually they tricked him, and they were able to put him in jail, and he died a terrible death of starvation in South America or somewhere like that, or Devil's Island. I forgot where it was, but at any rate, that thing of the conflict between, we can't have this white man in, and we can't have this, and we can't have that, that's been played out in real terms with our history. We don't have to come up with a Marvel comic writer. We just have to go into that history and put it together.
Wow.
So they were able to beat the French colons. Then they were able to, the difficulty with Toussaint, they were able to. Then they were able, the Spanish came from the Dominican Republic side, and they brought their armies. They were able to defeat the armies of the Spanish. They were able to defeat the armies of the British. And then the greatest of the Frenchmen, the greatest of the Europeans since the days of Charlemagne, was somebody called Napoleon. And Napoleon, a little guy who wasn't really French, he came from Corsica, but he got into the French military, etc. He was a small guy. He was physically handicapped. They say he kept his one hand in his clothes because he may have been deformed. But at any rate, this little Napoleon got this consciousness of Wakanda. He took his enormous fleet after suppressing the French rebellion, which had gone crazy, Europeans killing each other. Marie Antoinette, the queen, telling the people, let them eat cake. And eventually they cut her head off. So these are the white on white crime in the so-called French Revolution. Napoleon eventually institutes his absolute rule on top of that. But in order for him to do what he wanted to do on the world stage, he took his army to Kemetic. Can you imagine the sequence of a little man in France saying we need to go to Wakanda? And the French people are saying, well, where the hell are you talking about? Mm-hmm. I'm talking about Kemetic. And we don't need to go with the biggest armies in the world that he ran all the way to Russia and defeated everybody with. He said, we got to have at the head of the army and the Navy, because we got to cross the Mediterranean. He said, we got to have at the head of it the scholars, the professors, the thinkers, the visionaries, the artists. And 150 of the best artists, professors, and philosophers of France led the army. Ain't no army ever been led by that. But why? Because they were going to Wakanda in the ancient times, if you will. They were going to Kemet. And they knew that you needed to record everything that was going on. And he went, he saw, and he conquered, and he recorded, and he brought back that knowledge, that vibranium that's in this book. He brought it back to France. And he helped establish a golden age in France, the leading cultural nation in Europe. Not the Germans, not the English, not the Greeks, but France. And so Napoleon, now having this new, and his great artist, Count Valmy, wrote that here we stand before ruins of a great ancient civilization by people who, the founders, the ancestors of whom we now enslave. There's a statement by Count Valmy, the ruins of empire is a must. The ruins of empire complements the Cheikh Anta Diop book. The ruins of empire complements the Stolen Legacy. The ruins of empire complements Dr. Clark's Mentor's book. The ruins of empire complements Theophilo Banger's work and terms. Count Valmy was saying, here we are looking at the ruins that a race that is disparaged by us now built. Now that Wakanda, that knowledge, this little man, Napoleon, took, and he said, I'm going to build me a world empire. Now see, in the Wakanda movie, you had this thing of if this knowledge got out, somebody could conquer the world with it. Napoleon went and got the knowledge, came back and laid the foundation for a renaissance in France and Europe. And with the knowledge, he felt that he could take his ambitious ideas of conquest to the New World. But in order to get to the New World, after he conquered Europe, in order to get to the New World, he had to cross an ocean. So the largest fleet in human history, Charles, a little quiet, please. Here I am trying to get to a little point, and Charles is trying to find some documents for me. Charles, we got enough. We done did too much. I got a headache now because I should have been moving my.
We gotta actually let's wrap it up here because we're out of time. But let's wrap it up here, and then we'll convene the next time around.
Well, what Napoleon did was he had one.
Finish out and close it out with Napoleon and finish it out. Absolutely.
He had one major obstacle that he had to deal with. He had to knock out these other European forces and then dream of a new world empire. But in the new world empire, he had to deal with Wakanda. And Wakanda in the mountains of Haiti. And so the greatest fleet ever assembled across the ocean moved across the Atlantic Ocean to take on Haiti. And the forces of the warriors of Haiti were able to defeat Napoleon. So his dream of a new world empire in Canada, America, South America, and Central America was destroyed. And so this galactic struggles that we can put into the comic books actually have been galactic struggles in real time and in real history. So our youngsters, after the Wade Nobles and the Jeffries, and we just lost one of our greats, Les Payne, and we're going to be Winnie Mandela, and what. So, but the generations coming up under us who have dipped their toes into Kemet and the knowledge of Kemet, and some have gone like Anthony Browder and are actually in digs. And then we as an organization took 1,000 people in 1987. And so, and that organization still lives, ASCAC. So the potential for us coming together in a unity is real. And I'm gonna leave you with this. Napoleon was defeated and his dream was destroyed. Wakanda, that Wakanda in the mountains of Haiti is an extraordinary African achievement. And it's fantastic because you got to fly in through the valleys and whatnot. You can, oh God, I can just see what could be developed. And so, brothers and sisters, we need to tap into this real time. These Africans, like Bosman, Chadwick Boseman, his mother put his socialization in place. He had to read a book and write a report on it every week. That's what came out of his home. And then when he got to a point where he was slick and he could disobey his mother, he didn't read a book for 1 week and lied to her. And then he tried to figment a book. And he says that it was harder for me to try to come up with a creative book out of my own mind than to read a book. But then he realized that his mind was capable of, because it was successful. His mother did believe that he had read the book. So he was saying how he, as a child, began to get these ideas. And then eventually he went to Howard University. And while in Howard, we have all these Kemetic programs, institutes and whatnot. And he was in them. So he does not come out with the normal Negro family education, community education, or education in the Black schools. He's had this larger process. And so he's the one that said that when he did Robinson, our great revolutionary athlete, when he did not Robeson, but he could have done Robeson, when he did Thurgood Marshall, our great revolutionary lawyer, but it was Charles Hamilton Houston who taught Marshall, and he had a special African consciousness. So we have to see them as two brothers in the struggle. And behind Marshall's great achievement was this revolutionary spirit of force, a Wakanda forever, Charles Hamilton Houston. And the UAM leader, Otto Maddox, a brilliant attorney, he wanted to make sure we did not forget Charles Hamilton Houston as the foundation upon which the great work of Thurgood Marshall took place. And so then he did James Brown, a brother who had coming up from the South, had his style and his method, and was one of the great entertainers. So, and each of them, he had to develop a persona and a physicality for these roles. But when he said that allowed him to prepare for Black Panther, and he was saying that he was a creative genius. He could write, he was a producer, and then he perfected his acting skill. So he could see this role as a sea change. And so I want to take his terminology. I'm not in the middle of this. He's in the middle of the movie industry. I have a great disdain for the movie industry. I flipped the movie industry on its head when we went to see the movies every Saturday and the Native Americans were being beat up and killed. And so when I got back to the backyard, and I'm 10 years old, my brother's 8, I made my brother submit to the power of an older brother. And I tied his ass to a tree in the backyard. I roped him up so he couldn't get away. I had bow and arrows and I had hatchets, and I just went hooping and howling around him, unconsciously flipping the negative in the movie system. And then years later, I had to do the same thing in reference to roots. And I had to, even though the book had been written and I had all this knowledge about African history and whatnot, had been part of associations that raised it up, none of that, none of the degrees in the European institution could prepare me for this larger struggle for the global African consciousness. But Spirit said, leave this space. You are devastated. Go and get renewed. Go to your special Wakanda sacred ground. And I flew out of Savannah with Lauren Green sitting next to me talking about, isn't Roots great? It's everybody's history. And I said to myself, yes, it's everybody's history, but it's a special history for us. Little did I know when I landed in Atlanta and rented a car and went down on I-20 for the first time ever going in rural Georgia, and I found this sacred Wakanda space. And if we want to use that, I want to claim it, because this movie is going to be so great. People are going to be talking about this 100 years later. So I don't want to just say, as Professor Small said, look, you had Kemetic, you had the Yoruba, we don't need to use no movie. But this movie will be so important. People, just like I'm talking about the birth of the nation in 1917, after 100 years, they're going to be talking about the Batman movie in the Panther movie, not the Batman movie, not the Spider-Man movie. They're going to be talking about this that infected the consciousness, not only of Black people, but neutralized others who might have gone into disdain for Black history. So I see the significance of this, so I'm relating it. When I went to that little space in the forest in Georgia, scared, but I had to be fortified, because my mother wouldn't even let us go to rural Georgia. She said, you city boys wouldn't know how to act and know how to step off the curb, or not to look white folks in their eye or even laugh at them. It was something to laugh about them. So here I am, violating my mother's protection, and I'm in there by myself. Didn't have sense enough to get anybody else, and didn't have sense enough to really know my roots, because I got the car, I asked somebody, where's Kelly? They said, up the road a piece. I went up the road a piece, found some houses, and then I asked them, where's Midway Church Cemetery? They said, up the road a piece. In the South, everything is up the road a piece. So I went up the road a piece, and there, crossing the railroad tracks, I found this little community, several houses, several churches, and a graveyard. And then in that graveyard was my grandfather's tomb. Up on a hill, a citadel above all of this was a building. I didn't realize what that was. That was the schoolhouse that they built with their own hands. In the period after slavery, they built the schoolhouse that's still standing over 125 years. That's where my grandfather's children and whatnot went through those little schoolhouses, went on to colleges in the South, and went on to great things. So that was a Wakanda for me. And to meet in the cemetery the spirit of my grandfather, and to have the tallest tombstone in the cemetery, a Tekken, I needed a renewal. I needed this special something to be put on me, in me, around me, because within a few years, that was 77. By the time 87 came, I was into the curriculum thing. By the time 90 came, I was the lead person in the curriculum struggle of putting the African history in what we're trying to do, like we're trying to do now. But the fantastic thing was that in order for me to do it, I had to find some strength to resist all of the greatest forces, the Christian, white Christian forces, the Jewish forces, the academic forces, scientific forces. All of them said, single out this man and destroy him. And that will help us in the battle for the African mind. And I was singled out. No person in history has had so many negative things written about him and put into the modern computers. At one point when I was still teaching at City College, 949,000 items were after my name, and most of them was, he's the devil. But in spite of that, this great African truth that Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark and all the rest of us, them gave us, and we stepped into that water, was baptized, and then we went in full force and became what could become with that power, that vibranium of we are Africans. And so we know that Blackness is great, but Africanness is divine. Brother Small's been searching this thing for 30 or 40 years. Every sacred book, every sacred tradition he could get, he's been trying to synthesize it in him, just as I took all this knowledge of white world and the Asian world and the African world and synthesized it in this powerful connection. And this brother did it better than anybody else. And so I want to leave you with this brotherhood, this sisterhood that we've developed around the world. And as I mentioned the last time in the introduction, just as my nephew dedicated his great work, his PhD, to Len Jeffries, and I appreciate that because, and this is the symbol of our future, that the children will lead us. And so these youngsters who have produced the Black Panther movie are the product of a childhood we laid down for them. And it's going to be a rise, and not just through a poem by Maya Angelou. There is going to be a rise collectively of African peoples and their cousins. And the brother who was our commander-in-chief in the modern era is Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop. And I leave you with these words of empowerment, brothers and sisters. Dr. Diop, giving homage to his elders who I met, and they led me on my path to educational African style in Europe. Diop, this Marxist-Leninist, this Muslim, this master of French education, this Black nationalist, this multi-dimensional genius, he dedicated to his elder, and he could say also his wife, Madame Diop. I dedicate this book to the memory of Alioune Diop, who died on the battlefield of African culture. Not class struggle, I'm adding that. African culture. Alioune, you knew what you came to do on earth. A life entirely dedicated to others, nothing for yourself, everything for others. A heart filled with goodness and generosity. A soul steeped in nobility. A great spirit always serene. Simplicity personified, explanation point. Did the demurs, did the beginning of the creation, want to provide us with an example, an ideal of perfection by calling you into existence? Ideal of perfection, a Wakanda concept. Alas, the terrestrial community, which is where we are, trying to make a way, to which you knew how to convey better than anyone else the message of human truthfulness, that substance that we got to make it real. That truthfulness that sprang from the innermost depths of your being was deprived of you too soon. But the remembrance of you will never be erased from the memory of African peoples to whom you dedicated your life. That is why I'm dedicating this book to your memory in witness of a brotherly friendship that is stronger than time. When these brothers and sisters put together that real story, and they can have this as a part of it, that it is the brothers and sisters together in spite of the difficulties and the differences. And so we'll have a different process than what's going to happen with this marble phenomenon, because they got 2 or 3 more sequences to go, and the white folks is going to be in the middle of it. But if we take the African story in its fullness without all of that mess that comes out of somebody else's imagination, and you put the life of this family, Cheikh Anta Diop's Alioune Diop, and his wife, and how they nurtured him, and him coming from these strong Muslim roots, and him coming from the best education the French had to give to their own. He took all of those incidences of his life, and he bonded with others like Théophile Obenga with that French tradition. He bonded it with others who had a political desire for a Marxist-Leninist political party. He bonded it, and he said, and this I leave you with this, he did not anticipate that the president of Senegal would, who is a closer Pan-Africanist than most, would be asked by the African leaders of Nigeria and South Africa and others to build a monument that represents who and what we are, where we're going. A monument of the rise of the Black man who's been devastated by the system of colonialism and slavery and neocolonialism, by the Black man who has been separated too long from his woman. But there is the Black man rising with his woman, his rock, and they're holding up the product of their sacred womb. Blackness is great, but Africanness is divine. And out of this divine sacred woman comes this child. And that child is not playing with the father. the child is pointing to the future. That future is in Wakanda, wherever African peoples are. It's not in the north where the European has dominated and we look for sustenance. He's not in the east where the Asians, the new boys on the block, are emerging. He's not even in the southeast where Mecca emerged. He's not even pointing to the south of the African continent where other continents are. That youngster is pointing across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World African, to the African in Europe, to the African in America, to the African in Central America, to the African in the Isles of the Caribbean, to the Africa in South America. And it is that linking of the African family which will be the test of Africans producing a new world and a new direction for the global community. So you can't tell me that these things are happening by happenstance. There is a purpose and a reason for these seasons. And I may not get there with you, but African peoples are moving in that direction. In this monument is the great works of Cheikh Anta Diop, put in there by his son, his oldest son, Mbaki, and his French wife. The traditions that this brother had, this is not just an empty monument. You have the history of our people in the base. You can take an elevator 15 stories and go into the mind of the African and look out on the world. These things are not by happenstance. These are for a reason and a season. We have to retake the African mind in order to maintain control over the African mind. M-I-N-D and M-I-N-E. Brothers and sisters, we're on a victorious path, and we have to keep the faith and move away the distractions and birth again another world for African peoples. All right.
Thank you, Dr. J.
I'm letting you loose.
Thank you, Dr. J. Amazing.
Charles came up too late with the Pope.
We'll talk about that next time. We'll lead off with that one next time.
That's right. All right.
All right, my brother. Hotep.
Hotep.
Hotep, Philippe. We'll talk later.
All right, we'll talk later. Hotep family.